are live, Beyond the Booth Live, Gary, Keith, Ron, and myself, Steve Gelbs, and I am very upset, as I believe Gary and Ron are as well, that we are up live at 4:01 and not 4 on the dot, because just as we were about to start, Keith went and had to make sure that the laundry machine was off?
No, it was on and making too much noise, so I had to close the door, Steve. By the way, I love your hair.
Thank you. I'm telling you, it's coming off. I appreciate you saying that every week, but the clippers have been ordered. There's a back order on Amazon, but I think the 12th they're supposed to get here by. So I think next week I may look a lot more like Gary.
Now, when you get your clippers, Steve, and I say this as a veteran of the home clippers, you can of the cut all the way down to 1/16 of an inch, which is my. Have you decided yet just how radical you're going to go?
Well, I've watched some videos on YouTube, and I think what the best method is to start long and then just keep shortening up a little bit. As you can't grow it back as quickly as you can cut it off. So
it looks a little thin there on the edges.
You think so?
Like it's thinning out a little bit.
A little thin and very gray. Can you see? It is white.
I would talk to your agent if they ever do the animated Jimmy Neutron movie. You got to be at the front of the line.
The gray is certainly from the job, Steve.
Yeah.
Your hair has grayed in presidential years.
I have never gotten, despite that being an absolute fact, I have never gotten one offer from Keith to help me out with any problem.
Oh.
We're off to a roaring start, boys, here on Beyond the Booth Live. As always, we will take fan questions, so get them in. We'll get to as many as humanly possible. But you guys are fresh off another rousing success calling MLB The Show this past Tuesday. And it got a little dramatic because Jeff McNeil was both in the booth and called or on the call during one of his multiple home runs. He had a couple home runs in that game, right? Correct? So how was this experience a little different having Jeff in the booth calling a virtual home run of himself, Gary?
Well, I just want to say that I have been assured by all parties who had a hand in arranging both Jeff's appearance and the production of the game that it was not a setup. So I just want everybody to know that it was not planned that way, but it was great, Jeff. There, he was fantastic because had the best sense of what was going on. Has completed his terrific run in the play league, where they a series of 3-inning games and finished 28, and then went to the semifinals before he lost to of Tampa Bay. So he had a great sense of the game and how to play it and what the players should look like, who's underrated and overrated in terms of their attributes. He was moaning a little bit about how they didn't give him quite as much speed. He was fantastic. He had a great time. Wait.
Yeah, that's the least surprising thing I've ever heard, knowing Jeff McNeil, that he doesn't think that that they've given him quite enough talent there. Ron, I know it's now the second one, and everybody's getting used to communicating in a different way. Was this experience a little more comfortable? I know you guys loved the first experience, but was it a little more comfortable? You getting a little more used to doing this?
Well, Steve, I think we're in the middle of trying to figure out how seriously to take these broadcasts, because the graphics are so good that as we're doing the game, you can fall into the trick of, boy, this really seems real. The game's kind of moving along, and you end up catching yourself really calling a game, which shame on us. I want to thank Jeff McNeil. He made the broadcast. It was great having him on, and also how excited he got that he kind of hit a home run. I mean, it was a digital home run. It's not a real home run. He was really excited that he had 10 home runs in 11 games. So it was, I don't know, it was a lot of fun for us, and honestly, to get to know him better. He just, he seems like he's kind of quiet, not on the field, of course, but he's kind of quiet away from the field. And he's not. He's kind of a motor mouth and loves to talk, and it made for good TV.
Keith, similar takeaways from that game?
I thought it was terrific. We had him, 2.5 innings? Is that what it was? And I thought that was perfect. You know, usually we have guests on for a half inning, but it seems like the simulated games have solved the dilemma of Major League Baseball trying to shorten the length of the games. They've got it down. So I'm glad we had him 2.5 innings. And, you know, when he plays, I noticed one thing. I've tried to go up and talk to him, and he's always will talk to you during the season in the clubhouse. And he's always so zoned in because he's playing and he's preparing for a game. Here he's not playing. He was more relaxed. And really what we had for 2.5 innings basically was the three of us doing an interview of him. And I had questions I wanted to ask him about his hitting and his eye at the plate. And I just, I thought it was fabulous.
You know, it's interesting that all of you have talked that way about that particular interview, because I think, again, if you're looking for silver linings, nobody wants this to be our reality right now. But from a broadcaster perspective, I know I've experienced the same type of thing with the Cookie Club or whether we're on BNNY. You get this extended time with players in a situation where it's not crunch time, and you learn a lot about them. And I do think that from our perspective, it can only help us once things do get back to normal, just having these types of insights from these guys when their guard is down a little bit more. It's been really enjoyable to watch and to be a part of, I think.
Just be careful, Steve, because, you know, as you said the other day, sometimes it can go off the rails, as it did with Dom and JD in your last Cookie Club.
Yeah, it went very much off the rails. But hey, we're 2 months in. Beggars can't be choosers right now.
That's right.
We also, when we talk about the things we're enjoying right now, are loving, I know as a group, what SNY is doing with the 1969 games 1 through 5 of the World Series, airing every night at 7:30. Tonight at 7:30, it's game 4. You know, I want to talk about specifics from that team, but we were talking a little bit about this before we went on the air. When you watch these games, you notice just how far, not just the game has come in terms of how much it's changed on the field, but the broadcast has been, from my perspective anyway, so interesting and unique to look back on. Gary, I know you saw those games live, but did you remember quite how different it was and when the change visually really took place?
Well, I think there are lots of changes as far as the broadcast. Certainly the camera angles are different. You see a lot more shots from behind home plate rather than the field camera being the primary camera that carries the pitch. And so obviously that's a huge step forward for people's the pitcher hitter relationship. But I think also the announcing is different. There's no analysis. I mean, there's no discussion of strategy. There's no just relative player strengths. All pretty boilerplate, and that's the way broadcasts were back then. It was very much it was a carryover from radio, because most of the announcers on these broadcasts were radio announcers who were still learning to do television. Because, you know, after all, this was less than 20 years in television's presence as a daily force in people's lives. I think it wasn't until a later generation of broadcasters. It's interesting, Tony Kubek was sideline guy in that series, and you know, Tony was the first broadcast I was aware of, the first color guy gave into the things that were going on in the game that the average fan might got in hand, guys like Tim McCarver in the next generation, and but reached that point yet in 1969, and that's the thing that really jumps out at me.
I think there was a real lost opportunity last year during the 69 weekend to have me wearing those throwback headphones, by the way, when I did the interviews.
You can look just like Al Franken.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Keith, I mean, you were saying this before that your dad used to complain about the camera angles and how the shots were from the press box.
Right.
What were the types of things that he was saying about the broadcast?
Well, with my dad, I mean, we only had, when we were kids growing up until the expansion in '62, when Houston and the Mets came in, we only had the Dodger games, so it was 9 games a year on television. When the Astros came in, that gave us 18 games. So Dad, it's all about hitting. I mean, how could you watch Willie Mays' swing, looking down from over the plate like our broadcasting booth? The only thing you can tell about Willie Mays is when he stepped in the bucket, you could tell that with his butt flying out and go with one hand and hit a home run. You could tell that from above, because he was so strong. But you really couldn't analyze a hitter with that viewpoint. And you couldn't tell what the pitch was or where it was elevation wise. You can tell the corners, but not whether it was low or high.
And you know what I get out of it, Steve, is that if you watch the game in itself, is how quicker paced the game is, how the pitcher gets it and throws it. There's not a lot of histrionics in between the at-bats for the players, the hitters, or the pitchers. They just kind of move at a brisk rate. And Gary was mentioning Tony Kubek. I remember I listened to a game a couple of years ago, and Tony was doing the analysis, and it's just such a different job than it is today. I mean, I remember going an inning or 2 innings without Tony saying a word. It would, I don't know, it'd make our job a lot easier, Keith, if we could go every couple of innings and just hand it out to Gary.
We have had on BNNY this week, we've had conversations. They're pre-taped. They're airing tonight and tomorrow night with Ron Swoboda tonight and Ed Kranepool tomorrow. And one thing that Kranepool spoke a lot about was how from that series, the real pivotal game was game 2, obviously, and what Jerry Koosman did after the Mets lost game 1, 8 2/3 inning, 1-run ball, making sure you split that series, that Baltimore portion of the series. Koosman was supposed to have his number retired this year. We all know how big of a figure he is in Mets history. But Ron, I wonder, when you look back on Jerry Koosman, you guys had very, similar parallel roles on your teams, where you're this great number 2 right behind the superstar ace. You being Doc Gooden and Koosman obviously being Tom Seaver. What does that take from a mental perspective, an ego perspective, to just go out there and do your job without really needing any of that spotlight that number 1 guy is going to take?
Well, it's hard to speak for Jerry, who was just such an outstanding pitcher, and I really admire his career. I can only speak for myself, and I think one advantage I had was that everyone around me, whether it was Bobby Ojeda, later David Cohn, Sid Fernandez, and others, we were all just 1A or 2 behind Dwight. The issue was that Dwight at 19 years old was so far above everyone else in the game, including his own teammates, that occasionally you had to fight. Not fight is the wrong word, but you get a little pitching envy. Dwight would just make it look so easy. He would strike out 12 and throw 105 pitches, just mowing down lineups. And I know that at some point, I know I did, you felt like, well, he's 19, here I am 22, I should be dominating more than I am. And it's not till you have a little more maturity and you have a little more time in the game that you find your niche and where you fit. I think my job was very easy, in fact, because watching Dwight do his thing was so off the planet great that it was hard for regular players to even understand what he was doing at such a young age. So I was more of a fan of watching him. And then when it was my time, I was lucky enough. And I think Coos had a starting staff just like ours. And that is that there wasn't that much pressure on me to make sure I was perfect or excellent every time out, because with Ojeda and Fernandez and Cohn later, we had so much depth in our starting rotation. So it wasn't it wasn't that hard.
Gary, what made Koosman so great in your mind, looking back on his career?
Well, I mean, he was such a tough competitor. I mean, as everybody knows, Tom Seaver was the golden boy. He was the franchise. He was, as Dwight Gooden was with Ronnie's staff, head and shoulders above everybody else. But in a big game, or in a spot where a teammate needed to be protected. You know, Jerry Koosman is like the nicest guy in the world. I know you've had a chance to be around him, Steve, the way the three of us have. I mean, he is just the salt of the earth. Great Midwestern sense of humor, but he was the tough guy. And when the Cubs came in 1969, and Bill Hands buzzed Tommy Agee to start that big series in September, it was Koosman who went back and hit Ron Santo in the wrist and made sure that everybody knew that the Mets weren't going to be pushed around. And, you know, the Game 5 complete game victory, I mean, Game 2 obviously was huge in that it turned the series around and set the momentum in the Mets' direction. But the fact that he was able to persevere and finish Game 5 and be on the mound when the Mets clinched the World Championship, I think that's a testimony to his toughness as well.
You know, Keith, we talked a lot last year, obviously, while discussing 1969 about the impact Gil Hodges had on the franchise and how ahead of his time he was really platooning for the first time ever. He had you know, two separate lineups based on who the pitcher was. We see it so much more often now. When you think back on just what Gil Hodges meant, not just to that year, but to the franchise as a whole, what stands out to you when you're thinking about him?
Well, I wasn't a part of that, but all you got to do is listen to the guys, the players that played for him. Everyone, to a man, and even, you know, Seaver gets teary-eyed and emotional, have nothing to say, have nothing bad to say, all good to say about him. And I mean, glowing and respect. They just put him on a pedestal, and I've never experienced that from any other team where they really felt that kind of a feeling for Gil. And they all said that he was tough but fair. And that is basically what they said. He had their respect. That to me tells me more about the man. I wish he still was alive and we could have asked him. And the Mets didn't have a good offense. I mean, they got Clendenon late and they were able to platoon, and Clendenon was a big part of that push in the end. But, you know, they had a lot of guys, Boswell and Garrett and Weiss, where I think he had to manipulate the lineup and match up, because they just weren't they weren't a powerhouse offense. Am I right, Gary?
Well, yeah. I mean, they had, Grody played almost every day behind the plate. Bud Harrelson played every day at short. Leon Jones and Tommy Agee played every day. But the other four positions he platooned at, I found this fascinating. You know, Clendenon was obviously a huge piece. He came over, gave them some veteran leadership because it was such a young team. Came over at the trading deadline in June. And he wound up being the World Series MVP, right? He had 3 home runs in the 5 games. Do you know that Don Clendenon did not get on the field in the League Championship Series because the Braves started 3 right-handers in that series? And so the left-handed platoon, Crane Poole and Shamsky and Boswell and Garrett, they played all those games in the League Championship Series. And then in the World Series, 4 of the 5 games, the Orioles started a left-hander. Dave McNally started 2 games. Mike Cuellar started 2 games. So the right-handed platoon, Clendenon and Swoboda and Weiss and Ed Charles all played those games. And Gil never varied. Once he figured out how his platoons were going to work, he stuck with it. And what happened? They went 7-1 in the postseason.
Well, I also guess when you win 100 games, that's a winning formula. You're going to stick with it.
You know, I've been watching Last Dance like most of us have with Michael Jordan, and I was just thinking that, you know, he was all about winning at all costs. He was just a winner. It could have been tattooed on his forehead. Well, on the field, Tom Seaver was the same kind of personality, right? But if Keith doesn't mind, I think Gil Hodges and Keith have a lot in common. When Gil came to the team, you know, he just was not. He came from an organization, and he was the kind of person that just he's not going to be losing. He's a winning type of person, and I think Keith brought the same thing over from the Cardinals when he came to the Mets. The Mets were a losing organization, and when he decided to re-up with them, he just was all about, if I'm going to be here, we're going to win. And And I think in a lot of ways that makes them a little similar.
Well, not to give too much away from the interview again that's going to air tomorrow night on BNNY with Ed Kranepool, but one of the things he said, and he was obviously a part of the organization from the beginning, he said that as much as there's a winning mindset and winning is contagious, losing is contagious as well. And they expected to lose. And Gil was the one that came in and said, that's not okay. There's no longer an expectation to lose. So to your point, Ron, that, that's how those players felt as well. And I found one of the most interesting things to me about all of last season, having all of these guys around both in spring training and during the year, is how they used the platform of being out there celebrating the 50th anniversary to stump again for Gil Hodges as a Hall of Famer. They would bring that up unprompted constantly. To Keith's point about their reverence for him, it was a constant top of mind thing for almost every player that we talked to last season. Keith, you mentioned the Clendenin acquisition, and clearly that was, a huge turning point for this team. And one of the things, again, that these guys have said is that the Mets, it wasn't just that they didn't really, have a great offense before. It's that the organization didn't really put any thinking into offense. It was all about pitching and defense. How much can bring in a player like that, Don Clendenin, who comes from an organization where they do emphasize offense, who has that type of stature, how much can that affect players around him with their mindset on the field?
Well, there's a lot of players that Ronnie's played with over his career, long career, myself, that all you get out of them is what their performance is on the field. They don't give anything else. And I'm not being critical, just some people don't want it and don't have it. And others will just go ahead and do that little extra that means so much. And when it's a veteran, it means the world when you got a young team, because the young guys are looking up. Frank Cashin told me when he traded and got Frank Robinson to the Orioles, he goes, we knew we were getting a great player. He goes, but I didn't know what I was getting in the clubhouse. And he says, we were a country club team, American League back then. The National League called them a country club team. They didn't take guys out and double plays and all this. Because Frank Robinson brought a toughness to that Oriole team, and that made them successful. And Frank said they never, even with, because we might have won, but Frank was the guy that really propelled them to those great teams that they were. So I think Kirk Gibson going to the Dodgers, I did an interview with Hershiser with Gary Thorne not long ago. And Hershiser said that Kirk Gibson we were kind of soft, and Kirk Gibson came over from Detroit in '88 and gave him that toughness in the clubhouse and really made us hard-nosed. So yes, definitely, there's more that you can give as a player than just your performance on the field.
So even though we're talking about Clendenin, changing the mindset and helping this team evolve offensively, there's no doubt that 69 team was built on the pitching staff. And one thing, Gary mentioned that Clendenin didn't see the field at all in the championship series. Nolan Ryan only pitched 2 1/3 in the World Series. He closed out game 3, was it? He closed out game 3. When you look at Nolan Ryan's Mets career, Gary, he was good. He was good. He was up and coming at a 3.5 ERA in his few seasons with the Mets, but he really took off after heading west. Do you think that Nolan Ryan would have had that same level of success had he stayed in New York for his career?
It's always been a fascinating question, right? Because the Mets get vilified for trading him away in the ill-fated deal for Jim Fregosi. You mentioned Nolan in the postseason in '69. Don't forget, he came out of the bullpen, relieved Gentry in the 3rd inning of Game 3 against the Braves, and went 7 innings in relief to get the win and clinch the pennant. He had his moments, and that game 3 against the Braves was one of them. I remember throwing a 1-hitter against the Phillies, but he was so plagued by wildness. He was not able to harness his gifts. And he had problems with blisters as well, which they struggled to get under control. They moved him back and forth between starting and relieving. He was young and he was unpolished, and I don't think the Mets knew exactly what they had, but I'm not sure Nolan Ryan was really sure what he had. And I remember shortly after he got traded to the Angels, watching one of his games pitching for Anaheim. And I think, if I recall correctly, he went 9, struck out 12, and walked 11. And they just let him go. And he must have thrown close to 200 pitches in that game, but he was given a leash in Anaheim that he hadn't had with the Mets. And it took him a while because he was not a world beater his first couple of years with the Angels. He was still walking enormous numbers of hitters, but gradually over the course of the next few years, he was able to rein himself in and become a star. Now, does that happen in New York under the same scrutiny? Does he get the leash that he got with the Angels to be able to do that and eventually become maybe the most dominant pitcher of all time, 7 no-hitters and more strikeouts than anybody in history? It's a great question. It really is. And I don't really know the answer to that.
You know, Gary brings up a good point. He was a shuttle back and forth from the rotation of the bullpen. He also, I believe, was in the reserves. So he was going back and forth for his military duty. So that probably lent itself to some issues with his wildness. His beginning with the Mets was very Koufaxian in a way, right? He had a lot of outings, but none of them really, he didn't ever get in that groove. And I also think, and this is just speculation, I don't know if he would have thrived under the spotlight that Seaver had put on. You know, if he ever would have gotten to that point where he became, of course, number one on all the teams he was on, and maybe getting out and having a team count on him to be their number one guy and just letting him go, he was able to become the pitcher he was, a Hall of Famer.
You mentioned Seaver there, and obviously he wasn't just the number one on that Mets team. He's the number one Met of all time, the number one Mets pitcher of all time, without question. But it is a pitching-rich organization, and we've talked about Jerry Koosman. We've talked a little bit about you and Doc. But when you look at this franchise's history now, is it a 2-horse race for second best Mets career? And is that 2-horse race Doc Gooden and Jacob deGrom? Has Jacob deGrom reached that level already where you can say he's number 2 behind Tom Seaver?
Well, you know, the hard part, Steve, is comparing people who pitched in different eras. I think that is the difficult thing. Koosman and Seaver, of course, pitching in an era where complete games and innings and those things were very, very important. Doc to a lesser degree, but I think people forget how long Dwight's career was in the orange and blue. And of course, the excellence of Jacob that we're right in the middle of. I'm going to skirt the question, but I think, the Mount Rushmore for the Mets is, Seaver and Koosman and Gooden and deGrom, and you can put them anywhere you want.
Let me throw some numbers at you, okay? I went and looked some stuff up. So Koosman spent 12 years as a Met, Doc spent 11, and deGrom so far has had 6. So let's just look at the first 6 full years for the 3 guys, okay? Very similar. deGrom's ERA for his career 2.62, Gooden is 2.64, Koosman is 2.82. deGrom also has the better whip. Gooden has the lower home run numbers. deGrom has far more strikeouts. Again, it's a different era. So this is great, right? deGrom 11.3 strikeouts per 9, Gooden 8.1, and Koosman 6.0. But check this out. Complete games. deGrom in his first 6 years has 3. Gooden had 52. Koosman had 58. So that goes to what Ronnie said about it's hard to compare eras. What I will say is that both Koosman and Gooden fell off a little bit after their first 6 seasons. If deGrom can maintain this level for another couple of years, he will go very solidly into that number 2 spot behind Seaver.
I agree 100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Koosman is someone that we didn't bring up in the conversation. Do you think do you think sometimes, even though he is getting his number retired, that sometimes people forget just how good he was?
I think a lot of that has to do with, recency bias. There are a lot of fans who didn't see Jerry Koosman pitch. You have to be in your 50s at least to have seen him pitch as a Met. So for anybody under that age, certainly it's easy for them to forget. But for those of us who got to watch Jerry Koosman in his prime, and Keith even got to hit against him later in his career, it's impossible to forget just how good he is. And I would agree with Ronnie that I think you take those three guys, DeGrom and Koosman and Gooden, and you put them all in a basket. I think it's at this point right now, right as we speak, it's really hard to choose among them. But obviously Jake has an opportunity to outflank the other two.
Keith, what was that at bat like? What was an at bat against Koosman like, even though it was later in his career?
He got down low like Seaver, and real low. He had the big leg kick, and he was hard to pick up. And then he dropped down low, and he threw a bowling ball at you, which we'd call a heavy ball. And he ran in on lefties, and he could pitch in, and he did pitch in. And he had a big curve. He had a hard one, and he can throw an off-speed one as well that broke more, but it would get you out in front. He was no fun. When he won his 20-game season, he beat us, the Cardinals, at Shea. He had a shutout in the 7th. I hit a home run off of him. That was 1976, Gary, I believe, when he won 20.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was late September, and it was the only time he won 20, or the only time he won 20 as a Met. I think he might have won 20 again. I'm not sure. With Minnesota, I'm not sure, but it was the first time he won 20 games, and he had a shutout going, so he wasn't going to be, and it was a close game, and that's one of the home runs I'm most proud of, because I remember rounding the base. I didn't know how the hell I hit it. It was up and in fastball, and it was running in on my hands, and I just kind of just reacted, and I hit a line drive in the gap that went over just cleared the fence, and I'm proud of that home run because he was fun.
So once again, if you haven't been watching, you've got 2 days left to watch the 1969 World Series. 7:30 Game 4 tonight, 7:30 Game 5 tomorrow night. And then it's enough of 1969. We're talking about 86, boys. That's coming up next week, Monday to Saturday, airing games 1 through 6 of the LCS. So the series against Houston in its entirety, the World Series a week after that. So these are really, this is really a fun thing for fans to get to see, for me to get to see. I was born 3 months after you guys won the World Series in 86, which I know you love me reminding you about. Let's talk about that 86 LCS though. Game 6 specifically gets talked about so much, but is there one recollection of the series as a whole that stands out to you guys above all else? Ron?
For me, one, I can't wait to watch Game 6. I've watched snippets of that game, but I've never seen the entire game. So I'm going to kind of get myself a good seat on the couch and try to get through the 5 hours of it. I'm really excited about that. But I think the at-bat, of course, of Lenny, one of the best postseason players in the history of the Mets, the home run off Dave Smith, always memorable. But I think the hit I remember the most was the hit Carter had up the middle against Charlie Kerfeld, only because Kid had struggled so much, and he the 86 hopper up the middle, and it found its way, and Wally came in to score. And I just remember that was just not only a big hit for Gary, but it was a big hit for us, of course, to win that ball game. And I'll always remember that hit. I don't know why. And I think Charlie Kerfeld had gone through something, I think, earlier in the season. Our broadcast had caught him eating some of Rusty's ribs out in the bullpen during the game. So they used to razz him a lot. And he's also was a big guy that threw hard. So there's a lot in play there. But I'll always remember that at bat by Gary.
For me, there were so many moments in that series. That was the greatest series I've ever played in. We came back in every game except game two. Game two, we jumped on Ryan in the first inning, and Ojeda threw a gem. In Houston, we had to win that game. Go back home. We couldn't go 2-love. It would have been a little bit rugged, but Lenny's home run to me was electrifying. I mean, it was just, you didn't expect. It's always the guy in a postseason, because I think it's because the big hitters, the other team is very much aware of them, and their focus is on, okay, if you're playing the Braves, it's going to be on Aaron and Eddie Matthews. Back when I was a kid growing up, and then it's always the other guy maybe that has the big series, because the focus gets off the other guys. I mean, Weiss hits a home run in '69. My gosh. So, but Lenny's home run. I mean, we came back from every game, and it was a dogfight with those guys. And I mean, heartbreaking losses for them. That series could have gone. You flip a coin, it could have gone either way.
Steve, when you talk about, everybody talks about game 6, they talk about game 6 because it went 16 innings and it started late afternoon, and it was ending during rush hour, and people were staying in the city to watch it in storefronts, and that became the memorable part. But what's easy to forget is Mets were down 3-0 going to the ninth, and Bob Knepper was shoving. I mean, he was fantastic. And with Mike Scott looming in a potential game 7, and the Mets had not touched Scott the first 2 times he pitched in that series, if they don't come back and tie that game in the 9th inning, they probably lose the series. Is that a fair assessment, Keith?
I'll always say we would have found a way to beat him.
I have no comment. I was supposed to be pitching game 7, so I have no comment.
But I've gone back and watched that game a couple of times, and the mood in that dugout, at least to me, it felt like, wow, Knepper is really, really good today. How are we going to do this? And of course, Keith had one of the bits in that top of the 9th to help tie the game. But to me, that's everything. I mean, obviously Lenny's home run was huge to win that game at Shea. But if they don't come back against Knepper in the 9th inning of game 6, then
that's right.
It could have all been lost.
Well, that was going to be my next question. From an athlete's perspective, when you're in the game, Mike Scott was so untouchable in that series. Are you consciously thinking, as that game's going on, we have to find a way to win now? Or do you leave whatever's going to happen in game 7 to game 7 when you get there? Keith, was that something did that thought enter your mind during the competition at all?
Not during the competition. We knew that Scott was looming. If we don't win, Knepper was in complete command. He had a 3-hit shutout, and he was tough. I mean, Davey pinched hit. He had a great bench, and he pinched hit Lenny to lead off that inning. And I never second guessed, hardly ever. And I'm sitting there and going, I remember Davey was sitting to my right, and he walked down, or came into and he told Lenny, "You're going to hit." I went, "Oh my God, what's he doing?" And we had right-handers on the bench. You're going to hit Lenny? I mean, Knepper's nasty on left-handers. And what happens? He leads it off with a triple and gets us rolling. So we were a determined bunch, but we were up against we had our backs to the wall there. And but Knepper, and he was a very good pitcher. But if you stayed close to Knepper late, you'd beat him. You'd find a way, and we did. I mean, that was always it. If Knepper was a tight game late, if I was managing with Knepper, it would be like today, 7 innings, he'd be out, and I'd bring in a bullpen to close it out. That's just my opinion.
Ron,
I hope Bob
and for someone who didn't play, Steve, who just sat the pine, I will tell you, I've not seen this as a broadcaster, as a player. the people in Houston stood up for that entire game. I've never seen anything like it. I remember being on the bench and the fans would literally be just hovering over you. You could hear their conversations. And I remember saying to one of the other guys on the bench, these fans have been standing up the entire game. And I just found that amazing because you think they'd get a seat once in a while. Not for that one.
You know what I noticed when it was such a class act? When we won and we were celebrating on the mound and we got through our celebrations and we were walking off the field. So we were on there jumping up and down for quite a period of time. Davey was out and the bench had to come out. And so I would say, 2-3 minutes? And I remember walking towards the third base dugout to go into the clubhouse. And the Houston Astros fans on all that just looked on that first, all over our dugout, gave us a standing ovation. They were standing up and clapping for us, applauding us. And I thought that was really classy.
And then you guys celebrated in the clubhouse and had got it all out and had a nice subdued flight back to New York, and then got ready for the World Series. So
we do what we do, Steve.
So we talk about some legendary moments on this show so far. We're talking about 69, talking about 86, but we've yet to talk about the most legendary moment, maybe in Mets history. That was 4 years ago today, and that was the Bartolo Colon home run. That was Gary and Ron were on the call for that one, but Keith was watching, even though the game was on the West Coast. Gary, your call, I remember thinking this as it was happening. That is as perfect a call as you're going to make. What do you remember about the specific moment as Bartolo makes contact with that ball and you realize that's sailing over the fence?
Well, I've said this before. You don't ever script a call, but there are moments in baseball that you can anticipate, right? If you're in the late innings of a close game, you're kind of gearing yourself up for whatever's going to happen that's going to produce the game-winning play. The player's approaching a record, you're conscious of it and you're getting ready for record, or if there's a clincher coming up, something. Stuff is going to happen. This is one of those things that you could never expect. And remember the inning too. I think it was, if I recall correctly, I think it's the fourth inning. It's 2 out and nobody on, and then Plawecki, it's a double. And Ronnie, we always say the same thing, right? 2 out, the number 8 hitter gets a hit. Well, he cleared the pitcher's spot, so the leadoff hitter lead off the next inning.
Right.
And when Bart hit the ball, it was pretty obvious right off the bat that it was going to have a pretty good chance of going out. And you can hear the shock in my voice. It was shocking. And the way I reacted, I think, has everything to do not only with the fact that here was this 42, almost 43-year-old pitcher who was inept at the plate for the better part of his Mets career, hitting this home run, becoming the oldest player ever to hit his first big league home run. It was so much the totality of who Bartolo was, right? It was his age, it was his girth, it was his unflappability, it was him tossing the ball up and down in the air when he's on the mound. It was him throwing the ball behind the back when he was in Miami just because he wanted to. It was the way he interacted with his teammates, the way he used to take the foam roller in the clubhouse and bash it against a couch to startle people. He was such an infectious presence in every respect. And the at-bats had become must-see TV. The helmet flying off and him going spinning in a circle, and the at-bats where he'd just take 3 straight strikes and go sit down because he couldn't be bothered in that particular. Every at-bat he had was spectacular in some fashion. So there was so much to this guy, and this was now his 3rd year as a Met, and he had become such a cult figure that in the moment it just felt like one of the most startling and singular things that had ever happened. And of course I overstated the case saying it was, one of the greatest moments in the history of baseball, but here we are 4 years later and we're still talking about it.
Yeah.
And it was a singular moment, if not one of the greatest, certainly one of the most memorable things that has happened in recent years?
My memory of it is that, when we first started watching Bart in a Mets uniform, he had zero chance of getting hit, zero chance. And he got a little better, and he got to the point where he'd make some contact. And once a year, he'd put the ball in play, maybe hit a hard single or a double. But I think as he got along, and we get to the ballpark early, and the pitchers have batting practice, and you would hear stories, and you'd even see it, that he did have home run power. I mean, he's an incredibly strong, big guy. So you knew he had it in him. If everything was right in the universe, he could maybe hit the ball out of the ballpark, but you didn't expect it to happen. And when it got to 2-0, I remember the count was 2-0, and he took the first two pitches like he always would, like he had no intention of swinging the bat. He was going to take three pitches, sit down, but James Shields wasn't able to get ahead of him. And I believe it was 2-0. And when he would get in those circumstances, you knew that he was going to take a big hack. And 10% of the time, he might make contact. 90% of the time, he was going to miss it. Occasionally, he might follow straight back, but every time that the helmet was going to come off. And when he made contact, I felt the same as Gary did. As soon as they made contact, I said, that's a home. I mean, that is absolutely a home run. And Gary, of course, his call was amazing. And I don't have the words that Gary had. So all I admitted was a laugh. I just started laughing because it was just so improbable. And as Gary's making the call, if you listen real close, I'm just laughing through Gary's call the entire time because of everything that was involved in it. The home run, how improbable it was, how long it took him to go around the bases, what his teammates were going to do once he got back there, how excited you knew they would be for him eventually. It was just, and don't take away James Shields from it, because almost every pitcher, not every pitcher, but most pitchers would understand that, this was Bart's moment, but not James Shields. I still think he's angry to this day.
Ron,
I gotta add one thing to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Gary's, I watched it on TV. Gary's call was the forefront, but Ronnie's laugh. Ronnie has a giggly laugh. It was a giggle, and it was just the perfect tone, the perfect volume behind Gary while Gary's talking. And then when Gary finished, he had another little giggle, and I just burst out laughing. It was just classic.
The only regret, actually, there's two regrets. Personally, I missed the home run. I was walking either to or from, I can't remember, a spot in center field. In San Diego, they have that like beach deck area, and I did a hit either right before or right after. And so I had left my location. I didn't think I was at risk of missing anything with that part of the lineup up. And I was walking, and I heard Gary's genuine emotion in my ear, and I'm to this day I regret that I missed that entire scene. But the other big regret is that we did not get to see a video of Gary making that call. This year, the booth cam has become such a big deal. There's only one person who can speak to that, and that is Ron Darling. He witnessed it live. Do you remember? Did Gary chuck 3 pens out of the window?
I can tell you, until the booth cam last year, I had never seen Gary make a call. I never looked to Gary. I just listened to his words in my headset, and the import he gives to the call really starts my brain moving to a place where maybe I can help out on the other side. So no, I've never, I shouldn't say never. The only time in our history that I remember looking at Gary, and Gary will probably remember this game, it was our first year, and Beltran hit a home run, maybe in the 17th or 18th inning. And I think it was off Ryan Madsen. Ryan Madsen, and Gary gave it a double out of here. And after the first out of here, I was just looking at the home run and figuring out what to say. But when he said the second out of here, that's when I looked at him because I'd never heard him make a call like that. But this one I missed. I was just, as everyone else and Gary was, totally locked in to everything that is Bartolo Colón.
I could have told you that, Steve. There was a 0% chance that of all the things that Ronnie could have been looking at that moment, that I would have been one of them. 0% chance.
It would have been something worth judging, actually, if as that ball is sailing out, Ron turns to you to see what's going on.
Yeah.
We've got some fan questions here with the remaining 10 minutes, guys. One of them, it's not so much a question, but Roger on Facebook is bringing up other great Mets pitchers hitting moments. So he brings up the Al Leiter triple, the Dae-Sung Koo double. Are there any others that come to the top of your mind looking back at Mets history? Anybody? Any of you think?
Syndergaard's 2 home runs at Dodger Stadium, and these guys were there for Walt Terrell's 2 home runs at Wrigley Field.
I think the 2 Mets pitchers driving in the runs in '69 when they won the doubleheader 1-0. That's got to be one of the most
Koosman
amazing
and Cardwell,
things ever.
and don't forget Steven Matz's debut.
That's
4
right.
RBIs.
That's right.
4 RBIs and Grandpa Bert, was it?
Yeah.
And I'll take you back to the early days of the Mets, 1963, I think it was. Carlton Willie hit a grand slam, and I believe Jack Hamilton a few years later hit a grand slam. I think those are the only 2 Met pitchers ever to hit grand slams.
Okay. This question from Paul is actually really interesting. I'm curious to hear the answer to this. For Keith and Ron, what is it like growing up a fan of one team and then making it to the majors and playing that team for the first time?
Whoa. I guess let me go first, Keith. There wasn't any interleague baseball then. So the first time I ever suited up in a major league game against the Red Sox was in a World Series. And that was game 1, 4, and 7. So that was surreal. I had grown up such a huge Red Sox fan, starting in the 1967 Impossible Dream year. Yastrzemski was my favorite player. I wanted to be Rick Burleson at some point. Tony Conigliaro was a local kid that we all wanted to be. I mean, it just goes on and on. But I don't know if Keith feels this way. Once you start getting a paycheck as a professional player and a major league player, allegiances go out the window, and you start to bleed the orange and blue once you get paid.
For me, I got drafted by my favorite team, so I got to put the uniform on. So there never was that experience. But my first game at Yankee Stadium, I grew up a Yankee fan too, Mickey Mantle fan. And was it the Mayor's Cup? Is that what it was called?
Yeah, Mayor's Trophy game.
Mayor's Trophy.
We played the Mayor's Cup game at Yankee Stadium. I couldn't wait to get on that field and play in Yankee Stadium.
That was where Darryl Strawberry almost took Dave LaPointe out of Yankee Stadium. I'll never forget it.
We're going back with a question from Tom. And Gary, I'm curious your opinion on this. Tom wanted to know, he said this during the 69 discussion, how good you think Gary Gentry could have become.
I mean, he was superb. And the Orioles guys have said down through the years that, they knew about Seaver and Koosman, but it was Gentry who really surprised them. And he had a fantastic arm, but, he hurt his arm very early in his career and never had a chance to blossom. So it's one of those what ifs, kind of like, would Nolan Ryan have developed in New York the same way that we had the conversation about earlier? If Gentry stays healthy, sure, he could have been that extraordinary third piece in that rotation, which wound up later being John Matlack, who took his spot as that third piece.
Gary, can I add something to that? I know this is a hard question. Is there anyone today that throws a little bit like Gentry did at his best?
He's an over-the-top guy, and you don't just...
He was smaller, right? He was a smaller guy, wasn't he?
Yes.
You don't see a lot of guys who throw the way he does anymore. Kind of like Jim Bouton is the guy that I think of, but that's obviously an older reference. But he was a fireballing right-hander, man.
Yeah, I remember when we were in Baltimore a couple of years ago, and I interviewed Boog Powell. That was the one thing, both on the air and off the air, that he just wouldn't stop talking about, was how Gentry was the one that snuck up on them. And he was the big deal.
Davey Johnson said that to me, he said, we all came up the first time through the order. Everybody came back and said to Earl Weaver, it's like, where are the scouts on this one? Are they, this guy's throwing balls.
Guys, we got just a couple minutes left, so I'll end with one for all of you can chime in on this one, obviously. Working with Ralph Kiner, any favorite either moments, stories, just general memories of what it was like to do those games and be in the booth? I know they were so special for all of you when you got to do those games with Ralph Kiner. This is from, by the way, Timothy asked that question.
Well, I mean, those Sundays,
Go ahead.
those Sundays when Ralph joined us in the booth were always the best days of the week. You can't, unless you've been around the Mets as a fan or you know, working as long as a lot of us have, you can't appreciate just what Ralph meant to this franchise. I mean, obviously he and Lindsey Nelson and Bob Murphy were the original voices, but Ralph was so much more than that. Ralph great in lives. I mean, he was a star from the time he was a teenager. He was the greatest home run hitter of the 1950s. Who knows how many home runs he would have hit if he hadn't hurt his back. He dated movie stars. He lived an incredibly rich life, in addition to the fact that he spent all those years as a Mets broadcaster. And obviously Kiner's Corner is an iconic show, and these guys got a chance to be a part of that during their playing days. But when Ralph would come into the booth for those Sundays, for the few innings that he did, I just think there was such love and deference on the part of all three of us, just wanting to hear what he had to say that day, because he always came prepared. He always came with stories. He always would say something that would make you smile and maybe cock your head a little bit, like, wow, he really said that, didn't he? Because he had no fear. He didn't have to worry about any backlash. So he get down in the weeds, and it was so much fun having him around.
You know, I know for me, I used to get to the park a little earlier on Ralph days. He would do also some Wednesday or Thursday day games, and get to the park a little earlier because I wanted to make sure that I was done by 11 o'clock with the pregame stuff or getting ready for the broadcast, because I wanted to sit when Ralph was brought in. And at the end, boy, they used to bring him in on a wheelchair or whatever to do the games. And they would sit him down, and for an hour, you would just not only hear about the state of the Mets, what he thought their problems were, or the good things about the Mets, what he wanted to talk about, stories that he would bring up. And invariably, you'd end up in the 50s or the 60s. You never knew where you'd end up with Ralph. And he was just, you miss him. You miss him because no one brought what he brought to the broadcast.
I was working earlier when Ralph was long from retirement, was doing the games on a regular basis. And Ralph had to feel, getting older, that, maybe there's a changing of the guard down the road. He always helped me. There was never an ounce of jealousy. I don't think he had a jealous bone in his body. The one thing I noticed that Ralph did when I worked with him is that Ralph had a little notebook where Gary writes all his notes on his scorecard. Ralph had a little notebook, and with the ones you can flip over. And I looked over at him, and it was always when Ralph had a story about a player, an offbeat story about his history. Ralph, I think, went in every game and found something interesting about that player's past, whether it was his father or his mother or whatever, and he brought that to the broadcast. And I thought that was always fantastic. Plus, he had that right sense of humor. He had the great sense of humor and the great voice.
Keith, it wasn't that book. I would like to take a peek at the other little book that he had.
Janet,
boys, there's no better way, I think, to end it than with that. This hour flies by every week.
1 second. Ralph told the story. He was dating Janet Leigh. Oh my gosh. And they were going to get married. She went off and made a movie. And when he did a movie with Tony Curtis, and that was it. She wound up marrying Tony Curtis. She dumped Ralph.
But you know the story about when Ralph met Jamie Lee Curtis, right?
Yeah,
You've
you
heard
got to tell
story?
that, Gary. You have to tell that.
So I don't remember exactly the circumstances, but Jamie Lee Curtis is introduced to Ralph, and her reaction spontaneously was to jump up, throw her arms around Ralph, and go, "Daddy!" It's caught him a little off guard.
Oh, tremendous. I was wrong. That's the best way to end this hour. Guys, it's so much fun every week. Next week, we may have a big surprise for everybody, so stay tuned for that. But again, tonight, 7:30, Game 4 of the 1969 World Series, Game 5 tomorrow, and then next week, we get into 86 with the LCS Monday through Saturday, and then the World Series from 86 a week after that. Gary, Keith, Ron, great seeing you guys virtually as always. See you next week. Stay safe, everyone.
Good luck with the Clippers, Steve.
Oh, dude, I'm going to look very different.